110 Years of Weinstein Family History, Part 2. We can follow our story by looking at the April 1910 United States Census. We find the family has moved about 4 or 5 blocks from Rivington Street and are living at 7885 Clinton Street, still on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Mechil is now 43. Udel is 40. In April of 1910, although the ship's manifest says she was 42 in March of 1909. Malka is now called Mollie and is 19, although the immigration document says she was 20. Peretz is now called Perry, is 18, same as he was at immigration. He should be 20. Faye is now Fanny, 9, and Yoilik is now Julian, 6 years old. Mechil and Udel have been married for 21 years. Hence we know they were married in about 1889. All in the family are recorded as born in Russia, as we know, but we learn from this questionnaire that Mechil and Udel's parents were also born in Russia. All but Udel are listed as speaking English, although I don't remember Mechil speaking English at all. Their occupations and where they work are listed as Mechil, twine maker, and works in a shop. Udel, occupation none. Mollie, waist maker in a shop. Perry, twine maker in a shop. Fanny, none. Julian, none. So the older children are out working to help the family survive. In answer to the next question, had anyone missed work? None had missed any work in 1909. All could read and write. Fanny and Julian had attended school since September 1909, and they rented their home, not owned. Another column on the census form asks, mother of how many children? Number born, 4. Number living, she answers 4. This is interesting because we had always heard that Joe had a twin who died at some point, likely at birth because he is not in the earliest photo. We have one of Perry's engineering textbooks from Cooper Union. We discover from his inscription on the inside cover that he was in his 3rd year in 1913, so he must have started college in 1911. It confirms that he lived at 79 Clinton Street. He graduated from Cooper Union with a BS in civil engineering. His degree hung in the Brooklyn House hallway for many years and then was lost. He graduated in 1913 at the age of 23. We never figured out how he could learn English well enough in about 3 years to go to engineering college, and he spoke English with no accent. By the way, Mollie always had an accent, but not Faye or Joe. Mollie marries Jack Linschitz. The next event that we can trace in the records is the marriage of Mollie to Jack Linschitz on January 21st, 1912. We find the record in the New York City bride's records for Manhattan and the groom's record with certificate number 2774, January 21st, 1912, in Manhattan. She was probably 22 years old. There is a photo of the Weinstein family with Jack at the time of their engagement, supplied by Enid in this video. There are photos of Jack and Mollie and their 2 children, Bertha and Dave, who later became Dave Lind. We estimate these pictures are from about 1917, judging from the apparent ages of the children. From Mollie's granddaughter, Enid Crease Marone, email. Mollie had 3 children. Bertha Crease was the oldest, born September 27, 1912. Dave Lind, who was second, and a 3rd child, Lillian, who died of blood poisoning at the age of 4 as a result of a tonsillectomy. Jacob died at 39. We think the cause was leukemia. There is more about Mollie's children later in this video. Another record we have is of Perry's naturalization petition dated June 9, 1914. Somehow the actual citizenship papers disappeared over the years. We also have a record of Perry's draft card from World War I from 1917-1918. He may have been exempt from the World War I draft since during that time he worked as an engineer for the federal government in Washington. He also worked in Boston as perhaps the first Jew to work for an upper echelon engineering firm of Stone and Webster. Another event that we can document is Perry's second graduation, this time from City College on June 26, 1919. By that time, Perry had legally changed his name from Weinstein to Winston. Photos of that degree are on this video. He said he made the name change to avoid discrimination against the Jews. He said that the Weinstein name was too easy to pick out as Jewish on a job application or a civil service application. 10 years pass, and we come to the 14th census of the United States in 1920. The form questions have been slightly changed from 1910. The family is still living on Clinton Street. The address appears to be number 124. The census begins. Name each person whose place of abode on January 1st, 1920 was in this family. Mechil is now called Michael. Udel is still called Udel. Julian is still called Julian, but Fanny is now called Faye. Mollie and Perry are not listed. Ages: Michael 51, Udel 50, Julian 17, Faye 19. Year of immigration: Michael 1905, the others 1909. Naturalized or alien: all are marked NA, which means naturalized. If naturalized, year of naturalization. Michael is marked 1910. However, the only Michael Weinstein we could find in the records is in 1925. Marital status: both children are single. Mother tongue: Yiddish for all. Able to speak English? Yes for all, although we know that Udel could not speak English. Finally, and most interesting, trade or profession or particular kind of work done. For Michael, proprietor. For Udel, none. For Julian, none. For Faye, stenographer. Industry or business establishment. For Michael, candy store. For Faye, export office. Employer or employee: Michael is marked OA, which means own account. He worked for himself. For Faye, W, which means an employee. 1921. Perry begins his career with the City of New York as a structural steel engineer and designer. He retired as the chief engineer for the Bureau of the Budget after 30 years. 1921. Faye and Frank Blackman. The same year, Faye married Frank Blackman on October 30th, 1921 in Kings County. That's Brooklyn. 1925, Perry and Sid Winston. On March 18th, 1925, Perry married Sadie, known as Sid, Goldstein, who was by then teaching in Public School 61 and still living on the east side of Manhattan. Sadie, in her family history tapes, says that when the wedding day approached, her sister Mamie had just died in childbirth and her father was sick, but Udel would not allow the wedding to be postponed. She said it was bad luck to do so. Sid always said her mother-in-law, Udel, wanted to get her old bachelor son Perry married off. Sadie was 24 and Perry was 33 years old. Sid Winston says on her autobiographical tapes that after they were married, she moved in with Perry. He must have had his own place since he was not listed with the family on the census. Sometime in the 1920s or early 1930s, Mechil and family moved to Coney Island, and Perry joined the Democratic Party and became friends with the famous political boss of Brooklyn and district leader Kenny Sutherland. In the following years, Kenny, as he was known in our family, was of great help to Perry in fending off the anti-Semitism that existed in the New York City government. Faye and Frank Blackman. Faye and Frank Blackman had twin daughters. They were born about the same year as Arthur Winston, 1926. They are named Shirley and Dorothy. Some childhood photos are in this video. Perry and Sid Winston had two sons. Arthur was born in 1926 and Richard in 1930. For a time, the Blackmans lived in the same house as the Winstons on 64th Street in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, in the early 1930s. Later they moved to East 24th Street, Flatbush, a few blocks away from the Winstons, who were on East 26th Street. Richard remembers. I remember vaguely that the Blackmans lived upstairs in the two-family house on 64th Street in Brooklyn. There are pictures of Shirley and Dorothy and Richard and Arthur outside that house. I remember Cousin Dave lived there too for a while. I remember calling him for help one day when some kids were beating Arthur up on the street. There is more on Shirley and Dorothy later. The 1930 census. We have no 1930 census for Mechil and Udel, but we do have that of Perry and Sid Winston. The census taker wrote an extra letter E at the end of the Winston name. Those listed are Perry Winston, Sadie is still called Sadie, Arthur, Richard, and Carrie Kungstead, a sleep-in maid who is listed as a servant. This is probably a word given in the census taker's instruction sheets. The census questions are a little different. The address is 2260 64th Street, Brooklyn. It's located between Bay Parkway and 23rd Avenue. Question is, does he own or rent? He says he owns, and the value of the house is $12,500. Next question, do they have a radio set in the home? Answer R for yes. For us, it's a funny question, but remember in those days, not only was there no TV, but radios were a new thing. Does this family live on a farm? No. Next questions. Sex, race, ages. Perry is 38. Sadie is 29. Arthur's 4. Richard is 2/12, meaning he's 2 months old. Carrie is 19. Occupations are listed as for Perry as engineer, working for the city of New York. In Sid's history tape, she says they bought the house brand new, probably in 1926, and it had a tax abatement for 10 years. With a tenant upstairs paying rent, it cost them $30 a month. They stayed in it until 1935. In 1930, Perry and Sid bought a summer bungalow in Long Beach and spent summers there for 30 years. In 1935, the Winstons moved to Flatbush, Brooklyn. This was during the Depression. The new house Perry bought cost $7,500, and the 64th Street house was listed on the 1930 census with a value of $12,500. He dropped that house to the bank and walked away from the unpaid mortgage, which you could legally do in those days. As a comment, if anybody doubts the value of owning real estate over the years, the 64th Street house, which Perry and Sid bought for $12,000 and was built in 1920s, is now, meaning this year in 2013, worth $750,000 on Zillow, the internet real estate site. The 1940 federal census finds Mechil and Udel, now called Ida, living at 2313 Mermaid Avenue, Brooklyn. This is in the famous Coney Island and a place Richard and Arthur remembered. They owned the building, which was 3 stories. It had a store on the street level, and getting to their small apartment on the 2nd floor required the old folks to take the stairs. The building at the time is valued at $2,600 on the census. The photo in this video is recent, but back then the store was an ice cream and soda and candy shop run by the old folks. They are both marked as naturalized citizens on the census. One interesting fact is that to the question, where were they living 5 years earlier, meaning April 1st, 1935, the answer is the same place. Arthur remembers. The Weinstein's candy store ice cream parlor was in Coney Island. I dimly recall the candy store was named something like Perry's Ice Cream, and remember having some goodies there. Richard remembers. They must have sold the business at some point and didn't get along with the new owner, because I remember being sent to a competitor to get goodies around the corner. The old folks lived upstairs over the store. We were there on numerous Sundays to visit the grandparents, as was typical at the time. Mechil, Zeta as he was known, was a heavy smoker and drank tea over sugar cubes, Russian style. It will therefore be no surprise to find that at the end he was severely diabetic, and he had to have a leg amputated not long before his death due to the disease. He was also a heavy smoker and caused a fire in his bed by smoking there. Udel put out the fire by pouring buckets of water around him. Udel was very overweight and had a distinct limp and used a cane to walk. The cause of that problem is unknown to us. Remember, there were no hip replacements in those days. We have a few photos of them in this video. They spoke no English, and her surviving grandchildren remembers that Bubby Udel loved to play cards. Of course, we kids were subject to the folklore that Mechil was a bad, lazy businessman. I think Perry and the others really supported the old folks for some time, and I don't think that Sid Winston liked going to Coney Island to visit her in-laws on Sundays. Cousin Shirley's email. It seems like ages ago that all this took place. I do recall that Bubby lived with us for some time until she passed away. She was alone at that time. Our grandfather was gone when she moved in with us. She spent the entire day playing cards, sitting at the dining room table. We always were kidding her that she cheated herself, but she had doing that, and we never said one word to make her feel bad. She was a very pretty woman, even late in life. You could see how pretty she must have been. Our parents' father was extremely good-looking, tall, and thin. Arthur's email to Shirley. Nice, newsy letter. It reminded me of all the wonderful letters you wrote to me when I was in the service. They were appreciated at that time of my life. I remember most of what you wrote, but I have no memory of a raving beauty grandmother. She was a fat old lady with nice skin that cheated in a card game called Casino. The only problem was she hated to lose, so she did not think it was unethical to cheat. One time, my older cousin David Lynn wanted to make a point, and when the proper time came, he cheated and got caught. What a row. So I guess the point was only Bubby could cheat at cards, and since we were only grandchildren, whatever she did was okay. I have a vague memory of Zeta, but he does look good and great in those photos. Richard remembers. Although grandfather Mechil was always accused of being lazy, he was the one who got on the ship and came to America. If not for him, we might all be Russian. Getting back to our story, we have found the 1940 census for Mollie and her third husband, Herman Lesk. She was 50 and he was 58. Our earlier records indicate that she was 52. They lived in an apartment in Brooklyn and had been there for at least past 5 years. Her education was listed as 5th grade, and since we know she left Russia at the age of about 20, she never went to school in America. This is the apartment at which Jimmy, Linda, and Enid Crease and Matt Lynn visited Udel and Mollie as children, and is described later in this history. The 1940 census for Faye and Frank Blackman. The 1940 federal census finds Frank, 43, and Faye, 39, living at 114 East 24th Street, Brooklyn, just 2 blocks away from Perry and Sid. He was born in Connecticut and listed as a salesman of wholesale cotton goods. Their children are listed as Shirley and Dorothy, the twins we mentioned earlier. They are listed as 14 years of age. The 1940 census for Perry and Sadie Winston. 1940 finds them living in the house they bought in 1935. He is 48, a civil engineer with a salary of $9,000. The children, Arthur 14 and Richard 10, are listed along with a maid who comes from Pennsylvania. We found no census for Joe. Sometime in the 1940s, Mechil died. I remember his funeral. Grandmother made a huge fuss over wanting his coffin to be opened. It was a plain pine box covered by a tallis. All of the adults refused. It was a bad scene. Grandmother moved in with Faye, as Shirley remembers it, and also lived with Mollie and her third husband, Herman Lesk, as the Creases remember it. Maybe it was both. Herman attended Jimmy Crease's 1950 bar mitzvah with Mollie. He began to develop Parkinson's by then. Enid's and Jim Crease's emails refer to fond memories of visiting them in Brooklyn. In February of 1950, Perry became severely depressed and attempted to take his own life. He was rescued from under a New York subway train by a Good Samaritan nurse, but suffered the loss of his legs. Over the next few years, he recovered, and he and Sadie traveled the world until his death in 1959. Ida died 3 months later in April or May of 1950. She never knew of Perry's problems. Richard remembers. After Ida died, Perry told me that she was prepared to go. She told him that when she got to heaven, they would ask her what she had done to deserve to get in. She would say that the family had a well in Russia, and she always let the travelers and strangers use it. Cousin Shirley's email. Everyone said that Zeta never did a day's work in his life. Bubby and him had a candy store someplace in Brooklyn. Bubby worked all day long on her feet all day, and he sat outside and only wanted to look great, but no work for him. My mother always stayed in touch with Enid, Bertha's daughter. Enid visited my mother with her children. Enid remembers. By the way, I absolutely loved reading Shirley's notes, especially the one that referenced our visits with her parents. We were with Melissa and Rebecca last weekend and asked them what they recalled from those visits. Both of them have vivid memories of Aunt Faye presenting them with little bags filled with old perfume bottles and pennies, treasures for little girls. For me, since there were many similarities between Aunt Faye and my grandma, Mollie, the connection was important to me. Even the aroma of the lunch she always had ready for us was familiar. But I have to say, they were never blintzes. I remember being enthralled by going to Grandma's apartment, meaning Grandma Mollie, in Brooklyn when the kitchen was wreathed in blintz crepes. Boy, were they delicious. I also remember playing operator with Cousin Johnny Lind, using the wall phone that connected to the lobby. It hung just outside the kitchen. The kids were obviously easily entertained way back then. Jimmy Crease's memories. When I think of those wonderful times at Grandma's house in Brooklyn, of course there were lots of other families living in that house, but to us it was Grandma Mollie's house. I think of Grandma's mother, to us her name was Bubby, sitting there at the kitchen table, her breast resting on the kitchen table, leaving just enough room to lay down her cards, at which she always cheated. She knew everyone was fully aware that she cheated, but she didn't care, nor did anyone else. She was happy, and I remember very cute. Linda remembers. What incredible memories and pictures. I remember both pictures. What a beautiful couple they made. The kitchen memories are actually very vivid, along with the smells. Kasha and potato varnikas lined the kitchen table, roast chicken and pot roast in the oven, and babka waiting for dessert. Daddy, meaning Harold, always stuffed himself with the Veronikas, but loved every last one, as did all of us. As for the wall phone, I think we all played with it, along with riding the elevator up and down. Those were things we didn't have on Long Island and seemed to be one of the highlights of every trip to Grandma's house. Richard remembers. In your emails, you mentioned those family meals. For us, it was at Faye's, and pirishkas drowned in garlic water, but cooked by Mollie. My mother warned my father, Perry, not to eat too much because the garlic would offend the goyim in his office, and they complained when he came to work still smelling of garlic breath. Mollie's second husband was Mr. Rosen. His first name is unknown to me, and they owned a small hotel in Saratoga, New York called the Rose Inn, a takeoff on their name. Richard also remembers talk of a hotel in Lakewood, New Jersey. We really don't have a date, but it must have been in the mid-1930s, like 1937 or 1938, when he was 7 or 8, or he would not have remembered it. Cousin Shirley's email. Mollie's hotel was in Saratoga, upstate New York, not New Jersey. I know this for sure since Dorothy and myself and my mother went up there every summer for a vacation and stayed in her hotel. Mollie looked like Bubby, very, very pretty, had lots of boyfriends. Cousin Enid's email. This was when Bertha was in her mid-teens. She always said those were her happiest days. She wanted to go to Skidmore and did take some classes. She was a fine pianist. But then Mr. Rosen was killed when the oven in the hotel exploded. Cousin Shirley's nothing email. Left after the explosion, I think they then moved back to Brooklyn. It must have been sometime around 1929 or 1930. Don't know when Mollie married Mr. Lesk, but I do recall that when I was a little girl, he and I played Jim Rummy. Mollie died of cancer not long after our parents' 25th anniversary. She was only around 72, I think. Our parents met when they both worked at Macy's in New York City. Bertha was in ladies' slippers, I think, and Dad sold ladies' shoes. Family legend has it that my dad was intrigued with Bert because she ignored him, and he was quite the ladies' man, and every other woman fell over him. Harold always said they got married after Mollie sent out the wedding invitations. Haha. More later, and hopefully Linda and Jimmy can help out. Cousin Shirley's email. Mollie was a good cook and baker. She did a lot of this in Faye's kitchen, since Faye was not a good cook, nor did she ever bake. Richard remembers. I have a vague memory of the Crease wedding with Shirley and Dorothy Blackman as flower girls. Uncle Perry was not in favor of the marriage because Harold was, quote, only a shoe salesman, unquote. Later, Perry ate those words when Harold opened or bought a Plymouth DeSoto automobile dealership on Long Island in Baldwin, Rockville Center area, and was good enough of a success to sell it after World War II and retire at the age of 41. It was called Crease Motor Sales DeSoto Plymouth on Sunrise Highway, Rockville Center, New York. Arthur worked for Harold at Crease Motors during high school summer recess from Brooklyn Tech. Perry thought it would be good experience for Arthur as a soon-to-be engineering student. Harold and Bert had 3 children, James, Linda, and Enid, and we'll hear more of them later in this video. Enid remembers. Harold sold a dealership around 1952 when he was 41, and the family moved to Florida for a year. Upon their return, he dabbled in real estate. After a time, they moved to Longboat Key in Florida for 6 months of the year and then moved there full-time. When the time was right, they moved back up north to Mamaroneck. Harold passed away in 1995 and Bertha in 2001. David Lind. We don't know where Mollie, Bertha, and Dave, Bertha's brother, lived after the death of their father, Jack Linschitz. Dave stayed for a while in the 2-family house in Brooklyn on 64th Street. The Winstons lived downstairs, and the Blackmans and Dave and maybe Mollie upstairs. We don't remember where he went to school or college, maybe CCNY, but he became an IRS agent. Richard remembers. Dave and Bess Lind had 2 sons, Matthew and Jonathan. They lived in a house in East Norwich on Long Island's North Shore in the early 1960s. Matt went to MIT, as I remember, and eventually moved to Massachusetts. The Lynns had a home in Truro on Cape Cod for many years. John has had a career in California, first as a songwriter and with Disney in recent years. Dave was a good tennis player, even in his 70s, and it was his main lifelong physical activity. Dave had a good sense of humor. He was in my office one day when my wife Carol phoned me. This was very early in our marriage. She was out shopping for a bed accompanied by her mother. Carol was very unhappy because her mother was giving her a hard time about selecting a king-size bed, which was not a common item in those days. Dave listened to my end of the phone call for a moment and then said, "Tell your mother-in-law she doesn't know anything about fancy bleep." Remembers. The Blackman twins were exactly my age, not a year older. Shirley got married, her first, at age 19 to Herb Mendelsohn, and they had a son named Barry who became a chiropractor. I met Herb on Tinian, one of the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific in World War II, when I was in the service. Herb was in the Navy or similar. I remember I gave him my Army Air Force issued high-powered binoculars to take home for me. He delivered them and I used them for years afterward. Shirley and Dorothy Ross had an antique business for a while. After a few years, Shirley moved to Chicago with her husband. When Faye died, I tried to contact both Shirley and Dorothy, but I was unable to get in touch with them. As an aside, in my teenage years, I hated girls. Shirley was my only friend. She was pretty and popular. She tried to teach me how to dance. She was very loyal and faithful while I was in the service and wrote me extremely often. Faye was the one who held the family together in later life. She kept in contact with everyone. Shirley had at least one daughter by her second marriage. Frank was in the piece goods business and often spoke with my father, Perry, about stocks. He was not tall or husky, but he was a very good arm and Indian wrestler. Frank was also a very proud grandfather and spoke often about his grandsons, Barry and Eddie. Arthur remembers. Frank, even in his later years, was an Indian wrestling marvel. I thought I was unbeatable, but he made me look like a novice, and he might have been in his 70s when this happened. Faye, like Sid Winston, lived to a great age, 99. Arthur will remember her as a faint-hearted person who hated the hammering and banging she always complained about in her house. I remember her as a pain in the butt who always pinched me on the cheek as a child and called me monkey. Jim Crease's email. I vaguely remember being babysat by Dorothy and Shirley when my mother and father went to California, and them calling me monkey, monkey. They may even have photos. Richard. Dorothy married Jack Ross, an optometrist, and had a son, Ed, who became an MD. He lives in Florida and has twins, which seem to run in the family. I think Dorothy and Jack were married in the winter months when Perry and Sid, our folks, were in Florida. Arthur and I became persona non grata when in our 20s we nearly missed attending Dorothy's wedding. Arthur and I were invited to the wedding, but no one was around to remind us. We forgot the date. I got a phone call at home in Brooklyn asking where we were. Arthur was not home and missed the wedding. I rushed over and arrived very late. I don't think we were ever forgiven for that blunder, although Jack Ross was always a very nice gentleman. Richard remembers. Faye and Shirley had a profound effect on my life. At some point after high school, Shirley became a dental hygienist, and she was working in the office of a famous periodontist who was very influential at NYU College of Dentistry. When I graduated from Syracuse in 1950, I was admitted to the Buffalo University College of Dentistry, but I really wanted to escape from upstate New York, and I wanted to go to NYU. Shirley used her charms on Dr. Miller, and with his seal of approval, I got into NYU. Another debt I owe to Faye is that she was responsible for my meeting Carol, my wife, when I got out of the U.S. Army Dental Corps. Faye was a friend of Charlotte Davis, who became my mother-in-law when Faye and Charlotte and my mother set up a blind date between Carol and me. Joe Winston. Joe, earlier called Yoilik, was the youngest of the 4 Weinstein children. He was probably born in 1904, just after Mechil had gone to America. He is listed as 5 years of age in 1909 on the Ellis Island Ship Manifest and 6 years on the 1910 census. Family law was that he had a twin who died probably at birth or very early on, since the earliest photo shows no sign of him. Joe spoke English with no accent. Arthur's email. Uncle Joe lived in Washington, D.C. and worked for the federal government as an accountant or bookkeeper. Joe eventually went into the money lending business. He lent money to people at high interest rates. His 2 children, Michael and I think Linda, came to Peter's bar mitzvah. This was a direct result of Arthur's looking the family up when his family went to Washington. By that time, Mildred, Joe's wife, has remarried after Joe's death. Michael, Joe's son, had served in the Israeli army during one of the wars. Memory says he was 28 when Peter was 13. Michael looked a lot like Dave Lind and Arthur. Richard. Joe was mostly unknown to me. He had a twin who did not survive very long at birth in 1904. Joe contracted TB as an adult years before antibiotics, and at some point went into a sanitarium in the Denver area. I do remember Joe visiting Brooklyn from time to time. Once in about 1938, he came to our East 26th Street house with a little Ford or Chevy 2-door coupe with a rumble seat and took us for a spin. A rumble seat was a rear seat outside the cabin which folded into the body of the car, sort of like a hatchback. He met his demise, as Cousin Dave described it, by walking into a reservoir. Cousin Shirley's email. Joe and Mildred lived in D.C. area. They had 2 children. I don't recall much about them other than I think Joe took his own life. How, I don't recall. Mildred sold silk stockings to drugstores right after the war and during the war. She built up a nice business. My mother always stayed in touch with them after Joe passed away. Now, where they might be, I do not have a clue. Names either. Mildred is gone also. Don't know exactly when. I was not living close and really lost touch with the entire gang. Cousin Enid's email. As to Joe and Mildred, I actually vaguely remember going to their house in Silver Springs when Linda was at American U, but that was the one and only time I saw them. Cousin Linda's email. I believe that Uncle Joe was still working when I stayed with them, and when I saw them again later that year. That was 1959, and I don't remember seeing them again. He may have taken his life shortly thereafter, although I simply don't remember. Joe and Mildred's children, Michael and Linda, we now have no information on them. Mollie's daughter, Bertha and Harold Crease, had 3 children, James, Linda, and Enid. Jim Crease graduated Syracuse University 1959, went on to Chicago to compete in the 1959 Pan Am Games, winning the gold in the 8-oared rowing event. He left for Europe on the SS United States, returning in the summer of 1960. He held various jobs in sales until 1979, when he moved to southeast Pennsylvania, buying a rather large dairy farm, where he started a new career as a home builder. Finishing that career as a pioneer in designing and building of passive solar homes, he had 3 daughters. Jennifer, recognized in this country, Europe, and parts of Asia as a teacher in the field of Pilates, dance, and yoga. Elizabeth, mother to Emma and Olivia Carolyn, CEO of a Montessori school in Philadelphia. 2 sons, Philip, security director of New Barnes Museum in Philadelphia, and John, executive with Superfresh in Philadelphia. My wife Elizabeth, former police officer and supervisor with the Philadelphia Police Department, now devotes her time to me, her art, and her cats. In retirement, I devote my time to my art, sculpture, and local community theater. Enid Crease married Syl Marone, and they have 2 daughters, Melissa and Rebecca. Linda Crease Seinberg went to American University. She married Saul Seinberg. There are photos of Enid and Linda in this, and their families in this video. Arthur Winston. Arthur served in the Army Air Corps in World War II as a gunner on a B-29. He flew several bombing missions over Japan near the end of the war. He graduated Syracuse University in 1950 as a mechanical engineer, and he founded and successfully ran his company, A.D. Winston Corporation, in New York City for about 55 years. He married Judy Morgenstern in 1955, and they had 3 children, Ken, Peter, and Elizabeth, all of whom have children of their own. Richard graduated Syracuse University also in 1950. He graduated NYU College of Dentistry and entered the U.S. Army Dental Corps after the Korean War. He left the service as a captain in 1956. He practiced dentistry in Mineola, New York from 1957 to 2001. He married Carol Davis, and they have 4 children, Perry, Donald, Jennifer, and Jim. To sum it all up, or to add to it, Mechil had a brother in Montreal, and we visited there in 1939 and 1940, but never got any further information on him. And Perry had a cousin in New York, Nathan Sobelman, a dentist, and he was apparently a first cousin who perhaps was Udel's side of the family.